Hello friends, welcome to this session of teleconferencing. In this session, we will be discussing about Keynesian model of income determination. This pertains to the BA level course on macroeconomics. In macroeconomics, you might be aware that we deal with the macroeconomic conditions, that is at the national level or at the aggregate level. So, instead of the income determination or the level of income of individual households or individual persons, here we discuss about the income of the whole economy, the whole country. So in Keynesian economics, like this began during the 1930s with the publication of the book General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money by J.M. Keynes in 1936. And this brought out certain revolutionary ideas. At that time, the whole world, most of the developed economies were reeling under the Great Depression. Great Depression, it is called great because of the extent and the duration of the recession that was witnessed by most countries around that time. So what happens that during a recession, this is a part of the business cycle. There are fluctuations in aggregate income over time, and there are ups and downs in GDP and other economic aggregates. So during that time when the unemployment problem was very high, almost about 25% of the labor force were unemployed, most of the economies were like passing through a phase of severe depression, recession, extreme form of recession, and there is a crash in the stock market. There was a overall the economic environment was too gloomy around that point of time. So at that time, the main idea, that dominant position, was the classical economics. In fact, this classical, in fact, is a term coined by J.M. Keynes. He categorized all economists prior to him as classical, old-fashioned. The problem began because the classical economics could not solve or could not provide an explanation to the Great Depression, the business fluctuation. You may be aware that the classical economics, it relies mostly on three important ideas. These three important assumptions of the classical economics, if I recount, the first one is Say's law of market. It says that supply creates its own demand. That means whatever is produced in the market, there is some demand created for that automatically. So on the whole, the economy doesn't pass through some glut or some overproduction, or there is no scarcity in the economy also. That means in a way there is a continuous market clearing. The supply and demand are equal at the aggregate level, and this is managed through the flexibility in price and wages. The price level is flexible. So if there is excessive demand in the market, in that case the supply will come up, supply will increase, prices will increase. If there is overproduction in the market, in that case the prices will decrease. Similarly, if there is excessive supply of labor in the market, in that case there will be a decline in the wage rate. If there is a shortage of labor, if there is excessive demand for labor, in that case there will be an increase in the wage rate. So through this mechanism, through the flexibility in prices and wage rate, the market will clear, or the economy will be in equilibrium. There is perfect competition in the economy, in the markets. And according to the most important is that there is a dichotomy of the real and money markets. The real sector and the monetary sector, they don't interact or they don't influence each other. You may be aware of the quantity theory of money, which says that MV is equal to PY, where M is the money supply, V is the velocity of money, how many times money changes hand in a particular period of time, P is the price level, Y is the aggregate output. So your V is constant, the number of times money changes hand. Your Y, that is the aggregate output, that is constant. So when there is an increase in money supply, in that case it has a proportionate increase in price level. Similarly, if there is a decrease in money supply, then there is a decrease in price level. So this provided that the money doesn't influence the real variables, particularly the output. It influences only the price level. So if this is the case, if there is if the supply is creating demands, if there is a perfect competition in the market, if the real sector and monetary sector are separate, in that case there is no question of fluctuation in output. There is full employment always through the flexibility in prices and wages. There is no question of business cycle. But the depression, the Great Depression during 1920s and 30s, that belied the classical position. The classical economists could not explain why the fluctuation is taking place and how to solve this problem. So around that time, the Keynesian book General Theory that brought up a new hope, that provided some new solution to the problem. According to Keynes, he completely overturned the classical ideas. He told that classical assumptions are wrong. The classical explanations doesn't like it is the classical economics is not in a position to explain the business fluctuations or business cycles. And it was to such an extent, his ideas were so revolutionary, so different from the existing literature around that time, that it is often called Keynesian revolution. Keynes focused on the analysis of the short run. If you remember, the classical economists, they focused mostly on the long run. The short run analysis was not there. And you must note that Keynes never developed a complete model of business cycle or long run growth. He analyzed or he provided some solution to the short run problem. But the long run growth or business cycle explanations that came up much later in post-Keynesian economics. Keynes took a position that the economy is inherently unstable and subject to erratic shocks. The classical position was that economy is stable. There is no scope for business cycle. But Keynes took just the opposite view. So it is not rapidly self-equilibrating. The equilibrium is not attained automatically. According to Keynes, there are frictions in prices and wages, and because of these frictions, the wages and prices don't adjust to the equilibrium levels, and because of that, the government has to make some efforts. The government has to intervene in the market. The classical ideas was that the government intervention should not be there. The government should have the least or the minimum role to play in the market, in the economy. So according to Keynes, the aggregate demand determines output and employment till unemployment exists in the economy. Remember the classical position. Classical position says that supply creates its own demand, but Keynes says that aggregate demand determines supply if there is unemployment in the economy. Then he says that there could be disequilibrium in the economy. The aggregate demand and aggregate supply both could be different. And in turn, if the demand falls short of supply, in that case there will be inventory accumulation in the economy. If there is the aggregate demand is more than the aggregate supply, in that case there will be a rundown on the existing inventories. The production will be falling short of demand. And in this case, like so there is an if there is an excess capacity in the economy, in that case what will happen that the prices will not increase if there is an increase in the aggregate demand. If aggregate demand increases, in that case supply will come up automatically and the prices will not change. The aggregate demand, this is a part of the national income accounting also, which you have already learnt in earlier chapters. If we consider four sectors, the households, the industries, the businesses, the government and the external sector. In that case, your aggregate demand is the sum of or the total of consumption, total consumption, aggregate consumption, investment, government expenditure and net exports. Net exports means exports minus imports, X minus M. So in the simplest form, the Keynesian model assumes that your I, that is the investment, and the government expenditure, they are fixed. They don't change with the level of income. So in that case, what happens that your consumption expenditure, that has two parts. One is the autonomous part and the other is the induced part. The autonomous part, that is a very likelihood that the person has to consume certain amount in order to survive. So even if the person that has zero income or no income, in that case also the person has to consume certain amount. So that part is your constant, that is C, capital C. and the other part that varies positively with income. So if your income increases, your consumption increases. If your income decreases, your consumption decreases. So you have a consumption function of the form C, that is the total consumption, is equal to capital C plus CY. C is the marginal propensity to consume. Y is the income again. So this marginal propensity to consume, this remains between 0 and 1. This is positive, but it cannot exceed 1. It has one implication. It means that if the income of a person increases by 1 rupee, the entire 1 rupee is not spent on income, on consumption. It cannot be 0. The consumption increases, but by a fraction of a rupee, say 50 paise, 60 paise, 70 paise, something like that. So your consumption function is it comprises a constant part and a induced part. The constant part is the autonomous, which doesn't depend on the income level, and the other part is the induced, which varies with the income level. So this way the consumption function is given by, suppose I have a diagram here. In this diagram, the blue line, if you can see, is the consumption function, and here it is mentioned that C is equal to C bar plus CY. The lowercase c is the marginal propensity to consume. The red line, that is the consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net exports. It is a parallel shift, some addition to consumption function actually. And here I assume that I plus G plus net exports are constant. They don't change with the level of income. In that case, what will happen? That your aggregate demand, that is the red line that is shown. There is another green line that you can see, where it is written AD is equal to Y. Here AD is your aggregate demand, which we measure on the y-axis, and Y is the aggregate output, which we measure on the x-axis. So this green line, that is the 45-degree line. So on each and every point on the green line, you have equality between aggregate demand and aggregate supply, that is your output. So because of that, it is written AD is equal to Y on the green line. So what we get? We have the red line, which is the aggregate demand curve, which is the sum of consumption, investment, government expenditure and net exports. And we have the aggregate demand is equal to Y, that is the equilibrium line. So the intersection of these points, these two lines, that looks like a cross. So because of that, many times it is called Keynesian cross. It says that your aggregate demand curve that intersects the equilibrium line, the 45-degree line, and the point where the intersection takes place, that is the point E on the diagram, that is the equilibrium level of output. So here what happens that the equilibrium level of output is given by the corresponding line, that is Y1. So if the income level of the economy is Y1, in that case the economy is at equilibrium. If suppose the output, the aggregate output in the economy is less than Y1, in that case what will happen? Your aggregate demand AD curve is above the equilibrium line, the green line. So there is the supply will be less than the demand. If supply is less than demand, so to the left of the point Y1, there will be some running down on the inventories. There will be higher demand and the prices may increase, or keeping in the demand, the businesses, they will increase the level of output. Remember that the price level is assumed to be constant. Keynes says that there is no change in the prices because we are assuming short run, we are dealing with the short run analysis, and there is excess capacity in the economy. So in this case, to the left of Y1, I say that there is a excess demand and the supply will increase. Let's see what happens when output is the equilibrium or the actual production is to the right of Y1. In that case, you see that the demand is less than the equilibrium line. The red line is below the green line. In that case, what will happen? That the demand is less, supply is more. So it will add to inventories. There will be inventory build up. So obviously, when the producers, when the businesses see that there is inventory accumulation, if they cannot sell what they produce, then the supply will decline. So that means when you have when the economy is operating to the right of Y1 in the diagram, in that case, there will be automatic correction. Similarly, when the economy is operating to the left of y1, in that case there will be automatic correction. So this is self-equilibrating. That means the economy automatically moves to the equilibrium point. And if it is at E, that is the level y1, at that point there is no need to change the level of output. So this is the Keynesian cross, because the two lines, the green and the red lines, they look like a cross. Let's see what happens. Earlier we discussed that when the economy is not at the equilibrium, when there is less supply and when the demand is more, in that case there is automatically the supply comes up. But when the demand is less and economy is suppose at point y0, suppose in this diagram I take you to the next level, there is a shift in the aggregate demand curve. Here the initial equilibrium is y0. When the aggregate demand is AD1, the same AD is equal to y, that is the 45-degree line, where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. So when the aggregate demand and AD line, they cross each other, they intersect, that is the equilibrium point. So here I can see that initially the economy is at y0, and then suppose there is an increase in the investment or government expenditure or some exports, there is a parallel shift in the aggregate demand curve. In that case, what happens that at y0 initial level of output, the economy is not at equilibrium anymore. The demand is more than the supply. So this will provide incentives to the businesses and the output will increase to y1, that is where the intersection of AD2 and the green line takes place. So whenever there is a shift in the aggregate demand curve, in that case the output will increase. Similarly, the reverse is true. If there is a decrease in the demand curve, if there is a downward shift in the demand curve, in that case aggregate output will decrease. So this is another case, like this is the case where there is a change in the aggregate demand curve, but here I show that your consumption function shifts. There is a change in the marginal propensity to consume. So from AD1 to AD2, there is an increase in MPC, or the marginal propensity to consume. So because of that, there is a tilt in the aggregate demand curve. Again, in this case, the intersection between the aggregate demand and aggregate supply, that provides the equilibrium point. Let's come back to the second diagram where we have the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Here what is happening, the economy is at equilibrium, and if the government tries to increase the level of output, then there should be some increase in demand, aggregate demand. And this one, when there is a totally, let's imagine the case of Great Depression or any recession, in that case suppose the demand is not sufficient, there is some deficit in demand or insufficient demand for outputs, goods and services. In that case, the government can increase government expenditure so that there is an increase in the aggregate demand and there is an increase in output. This was the solution provided by Keynes to the Great Depression problem. So what is suggested that the government should build some during the recession, the government should boost aggregate demand mainly through government expenditure, and it should reduce taxes so that it leaves more income with the people, in the hands of people. There will be more disposable income. Just the opposite situation should be there in the case of inflationary situation. If the economy has reached full employment level, and at that point if there is some inflationary pressure, if the economy is passing through some overproduction, in that case government should resort to some surplus budget. The government should increase taxes so that there is a less money or less income in the hands of people, and aggregate demand comes or shifts downward. So according to Keynes, the role of government is counter-cyclical. It moderates the effectiveness or the intensity of the business fluctuation or the business cycle. So this, according to Keynes, the government has an active role to play. So in case there is a recession, the government should come up, invest more. If there is overproduction, in that case the government should reduce expenditure and there should be surplus budget. This has like how this Keynesian model worked. In that time, it was widely accepted because the classical economists, they suggested that the government should have least role, minimum role to play, but Keynes suggested an active role for the government. So this found some political patronage. This got accepted widely by the government all over the world. This provided a lot of discretion to the government. Earlier, the classical economists, they left it to the market forces. Here, the government has an active role or some proactive role to play. It was in synchronization with political interest. Further, the role, the success of some of the communist countries around that time, that provided some incentive or that came up as an that evidence in support of this Keynesian economics, Keynesian model. This obviously increased the size of the government, but this enjoyed with the its heydays during 1950s and 60s. But the problem that came up in the market during 1970s, that created a lot of problem that particularly the Keynesian model could not solve the problem that was perceived or that was experienced by the world during 1970s. And again, there was a revival of the classical economists, the classical positions, which we call mostly new classical economics. So this was the Keynesian economics that enjoyed its heydays, its prime time during 1950s and 60s. The Keynesian model projected some active role for the government, but the new classical economics, which came up during 1970s, it again reversed the Keynesian position. There is particularly one person, that Lucas. He came up with some severe criticism of the Keynesian model, and this new classical economists, they brought in some more developments into the macroeconomic theory. And this new classical economics, they propagated the classical views. They came up again with the minimal role for the government, and they suggested that the government should intervene minimally in the market. I hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you very much.